Allen Iverson was never built to be ignored. Long before the awards, the sold-out arenas, the screaming crowds, and the endless highlight reels, he was just a young kid from Hampton, Virginia, trying to survive a world that did not give him many soft places to land. He was small by basketball standards, barely 6 feet tall, thin, fast, fearless, and carrying more pain than most people ever saw. But when he stepped onto a court, something changed. The anger became speed. The pressure became rhythm. The pain became art. And for a while, Allen Iverson made the impossible look normal. He was not the tallest. He was not the strongest. He was not the clean, polished superstar the league usually wanted to put on posters. But he had something far more dangerous. He had heart. He had defiance. He had the kind of confidence that made bigger men step backward. Every time he crossed someone over, every time he hit the floor and got back up, every time he attacked the rim like he was not afraid of anyone, fans saw more than basketball. They saw survival. That was the magic of Allen Iverson. He did not look like he belonged in the NBA machine, and that was exactly why people loved him. He wore his hair in cornrows. He covered his body in tattoos. He brought hip-hop culture into arenas that were not ready to accept it. He dressed how he wanted. He talked how he wanted. He played how he wanted. And whether the league liked it or not, millions of people saw themselves in him. To them, Allen Iverson was not just a player. He was proof that you did not have to change your soul to become great. But greatness came with a cost. By the time Iverson became the face of the Philadelphia 76ers, the pressure around him was enormous. Every shot mattered. Every loss became his fault. Every word he said was analyzed. Every mistake became a headline. He was expected to carry a franchise, inspire a city, entertain the world, and still somehow remain untouched by the weight of it all. In 2001, he reached the peak of his basketball life. He won the MVP award and dragged the 76ers all the way to the NBA Finals. Against the powerful Los Angeles Lakers, led by Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant, Iverson gave fans one of the most unforgettable moments in basketball history. He hit a shot, stepped over Tyronn Lue, and turned 1 second of defiance into an image that would live forever. But behind that legendary moment was a man who was already giving everything he had. Iverson played through pain. He took brutal hits. He crashed into giants night after night. He was knocked down so often that getting up became part of his identity. Fans cheered because they thought he was invincible. But nobody is invincible. Not even Allen Iverson. The sad truth is that the same fire that made him great also made his life complicated. He was emotional, intense, loyal, stubborn, and often misunderstood. The media did not always know what to do with him. To some, he was a rebel. To others, he was a problem. But to the people who truly watched him, Iverson was something much deeper. He was a man fighting to be accepted without being erased. And that fight followed him everywhere. As the years passed, the league changed. His body changed. Teams changed. The game that once seemed built around his fearless attacks began moving in another direction. Younger stars arrived. His role became uncertain. And for a man who had spent his entire life being defined by basketball, that transition was painful to watch. Because what happens to a warrior when the battle ends? For Allen Iverson, retirement was not just walking away from a job. It was walking away from the only place where his pain made sense. On the court, he knew exactly who he was. Off the court, the answers were not so simple. There were stories about money, stories about partying, stories about drinking, stories about relationships, mistakes, and regret. Some were exaggerated. Some were misunderstood. Some had pieces of truth. But all of them pointed to one heartbreaking reality. The man who once carried an entire city was now trying to carry himself. And that is what makes Allen Iverson's story so hard to watch. Not because he stopped being great, not because people stopped loving him, but because behind the legend was a human being who had been wounded long before the world ever called him a star. Today, when fans look at Allen Iverson, they do not just see the crossover, the MVP trophy, or the fearless scorer who changed the NBA forever. They see a man try to make peace with everything fame gave him and everything it took away. And the most painful part is this. Allen Iverson gave basketball everything he had. But basketball could not protect him from life. For Allen Iverson, the hardest opponent was never Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, or Shaquille O'Neal. The hardest opponent was always the world outside the court. Basketball had rules. Basketball had a scoreboard. Basketball had a clock. You knew when the game started, when it ended, and what you had to do to win. But life was different. Life did not give Iverson a clear playbook. It did not explain how to handle fame when it arrived too fast. It did not teach him how to protect himself from people who wanted something from him. It did not show him how to heal from the pain he carried since childhood. And maybe that is why his story still feels so heavy. When Allen Iverson became a superstar, he was not just playing basketball. He was carrying an identity. To millions of young fans, especially those who felt judged, overlooked, or misunderstood, Iverson represented freedom. He was the guy who refused to become a corporate product. He did not smooth out his edges to make other people comfortable. He did not pretend to come from a perfect life. He walked into the NBA with his tattoos, his cornrows, his street style, his raw emotion, and his unapologetic truth. That made him beloved, but also made him a target. The NBA wanted stars, but it also wanted control. It wanted excitement, but not too much rebellion. It wanted personality, but only the kind that could be packaged neatly for sponsors and families watching at home. Iverson did not fit that mold. He was too real, too emotional, too unfiltered, too connected to a culture the league was still learning how to embrace. So every part of him became a debate. His clothes became a debate. His music became a debate. His friends became a debate. His attitude became a debate. Even his pain became something people judged from a distance. Instead of asking why he was so guarded, people called him difficult. Instead of understanding the pressure on his shoulders, people said he was selfish. Instead of seeing a young man trying to survive fame, they saw a headline. And perhaps nothing showed that more than the infamous practice moment. To some people, it became a joke, a meme before memes took over the internet. They repeated the word practice over and over, laughing at the idea that a professional athlete could sound so dismissive. But when you listen deeper, that moment was never really about practice. It was about grief. It was about frustration. It was about a man who felt like the world kept missing the point. Iverson had just lost a close friend. He was hurting. He was tired. He was being questioned in a way that made him feel like his dedication was being reduced to one issue. But the world did what it often does to complicated people. It took one emotional moment and turned it into a label. That label followed him for years. And that is part of the tragedy. Allen Iverson gave everything on the court, yet somehow people still questioned whether he cared enough. He played injured. He attacked defenders twice his size. He threw his body into collisions most players would avoid. He left pieces of himself on hardwood floors across America. Still, the conversation often became about what he did wrong, not what he sacrificed. That kind of misunderstanding can wear down anyone. As Iverson got older, the signs became harder to ignore. His body could no longer do what his spirit demanded. The explosive first step was not the same. The fearless drives became more difficult. Teams began to see him less as a franchise savior and more as a complicated veteran. The same confidence that had made him iconic was now used against him. People wondered whether he could accept a smaller role. They questioned whether he could adjust. But imagine being Allen Iverson. Imagine spending your whole life proving people wrong. Imagine becoming an MVP by refusing to back down. Imagine surviving because you believed in yourself when nobody else did. Then imagine being told that the very fire that made you legendary now needed to be dimmed. That is not an easy thing to accept. His final years in the NBA were painful because they did not feel like a proper farewell. There was no perfect goodbye tour. No smooth ending where the crowd knew exactly when to stand and cheer. Instead, there was confusion, frustration, short stops with different teams, and the quiet realization that one of the most electric players in basketball history was slowly being pushed toward the exit. For fans who grew up with him, it was hard to watch, because Allen Iverson was never supposed to fade quietly. He was supposed to leave the way he played, loud, fearless, unforgettable. But life rarely gives legends the ending they deserve. Sometimes it gives them silence. Sometimes it gives them rumors. Sometimes it gives them a mirror and forces them to face everything they avoided while the crowd was still cheering. After basketball, Iverson had to confront a question many athletes fear. Who am I when the game is gone? That question can destroy people. For decades, athletes train their bodies, their minds, and their identities around competition. Every day has structure. Every mistake has film. Every success has applause. But retirement removes the noise. Suddenly, there are no arenas, no game plans, no defenders to beat. Just memories. Just headlines. Just the people who still expect you to be the version of yourself they remember. And for Iverson, that version was almost impossible to live up to. The world wanted him to remain the answer, but he was still searching for answers himself. Stories about his lifestyle became part of the public conversation. People talked about money problems, parties, alcohol, and personal struggles as if they were entertainment. They forgot that behind every rumor was a real person. A father, a son, a man who had been famous since his early 20s and had never truly been allowed to grow in private. That is the cruel side of fame. When you rise as fast as Allen Iverson did, people cheer for your talent. But when you struggle, those same people sometimes act surprised that you are human. They celebrate your pain when it makes you heroic, then criticize it when it becomes messy. But Iverson's story is not simply about downfall. It is also about survival. Because through all the noise, all the criticism, all the mistakes, and all the years of being misunderstood, Allen Iverson never disappeared from the hearts of fans. People still chant his name. Young players still credit him for changing the culture. His influence still lives in every guard who plays with swagger, every athlete who expresses himself freely, every superstar who understands that authenticity can be more powerful than perfection. Allen Iverson may not have had a perfect ending in basketball, but his impact never ended. And maybe that is what makes his current chapter so emotional. Fans are not just watching a former athlete grow older. They are watching a symbol of their youth face the consequences of a life lived under pressure. They are watching a man who once seemed untouchable admit, through his presence and his story, that even legends bleed. He was called the answer, but the older he gets, the more his life reminds us of something deeper. Sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who never fall. They're the ones who keep standing, even when the world only remembers the fall. What made Allen Iverson different was not just the way he played. It was the way people reacted to him. Some athletes are admired. Some are respected. Some are studied. But Iverson was felt. He reached people in a place statistics could never explain. You could show his points per game, his assists, his steals, his minutes, his awards, and still miss the real reason he mattered. Allen Iverson was not only a basketball player. He was emotion in motion. Every time he touched the ball, something could happen. A defender could fall. A crowd could explode. A coach could panic. A game could shift. But more than that, a kid watching from a small apartment, a broken home, or a rough neighborhood could believe, even for a second, that being underestimated did not mean being defeated. That was Iverson's true power. He made small look strong. He made pain look stylish. He made rebellion look beautiful. He made people who had never felt welcome in the polished world of professional sports feel like they had finally been invited inside. And because of that, his fans did not just cheer for him. They protected him. They understood him in a way the critics often refused to. But love from fans does not always save a man from himself. When the lights are bright, applause can feel like healing. It can cover loneliness. It can drown out fear. It can make a person believe that as long as the crowd is screaming, everything is okay. But when the games end and the arena empties, the silence can be brutal. For Iverson, that silence may have been louder than any crowd he ever heard. During his career, he was constantly moving. Practices, games, flights, interviews, injuries, criticism, family pressure, financial pressure, emotional pressure. There was always something happening. Always another city. Always another opponent. Always another headline. The chaos became normal. Maybe even comfortable. But retirement took away the chaos that had given his life structure. And when structure disappears, old wounds have a way of coming back. That is one of the saddest truths about athletes who grow up in survival mode. They become experts at performing through pain, but not always at processing it. They learn how to win games, not how to rest. They learn how to silence critics, not how to sit with grief. They learn how to be strong in public, but not how to be vulnerable in private. Iverson was built for battle, but peace was harder. After leaving the NBA, his name often appeared in conversations that had little to do with the beauty of his game. People talked about his finances. They talked about his lifestyle. They talked about rumors, appearances, and moments that seemed concerning. And every time, the public reacted the same way: shock, judgment, pity, or cruel entertainment. But the truth is more complicated than a headline. Allen Iverson had spent years living at a speed most people cannot imagine. Money came fast. Fame came fast. Responsibility came fast. And with that came people, pressure, temptation, and expectations. When you're young, rich, hurt, and celebrated by millions, it can become difficult to know who is around you for love and who is around you for access. That kind of life can make a person guarded. It can also make a person lonely. And loneliness is dangerous when the whole world thinks you have everything. That is why Iverson's story hits so hard. From the outside, he lived the dream. He had the mansion, the jewelry, the cars, the fame, the applause, the commercials, the iconic shoes, and the respect of players around the world. But the dream, when lived without peace, can become another kind of prison. People wanted the legend, but Allen Iverson still had to live as the man. And the man had flaws. He made mistakes. He hurt people. He was hurt by people. He sometimes fought battles in ways that only created more damage. But reducing him to those mistakes is unfair because his life was never simple. It was shaped by poverty, trauma, legal trouble as a teenager, sudden fame, racial judgment, cultural backlash, injuries, and the impossible demand to be both authentic and acceptable at the same time. That demand can break a person. What makes Iverson's later years emotional is not that he became forgotten. He did not. In fact, his cultural influence may be stronger now than it was when he played. Modern NBA stars dress with freedom, speak with confidence, embrace hip-hop openly, and build brands around their real personalities. Much of that road was cleared by Allen Iverson. He took the criticism so others could move more freely. That is why players still speak his name with reverence. They know what he meant. They know he changed more than a box score. He changed the league's image. He changed what a superstar could look like. He changed what a young black athlete could express without apology. He gave future generations permission to be themselves. But here is the painful question. Did the game ever give enough back to him? Not in money, not in awards, not in applause, but in understanding. Because understanding is what Iverson seemed to chase for much of his life. He did not want to be perfect. He wanted to be seen clearly. He wanted people to know that behind the attitude was pain. Behind the confidence was fear. Behind the defiance was a person who had been forced to protect himself from a young age. And maybe that is why his nickname feels so tragic now. The answer. For years, everyone expected Allen Iverson to be the answer. The answer for Philadelphia. The answer for the NBA's entertainment. The answer for fans who wanted hope. The answer for kids who needed a hero. The answer for a culture that wanted representation. But who was supposed to be the answer for him? Who was supposed to help the man when the symbol became too heavy to carry? That is the part people rarely talk about. Fans often love athletes for what they give, but forget to ask what it cost them to give that much. Iverson gave his body. He gave his image. He gave his anger. He gave his joy. He gave his pain. He gave everything that made him human, and the world turned it into entertainment. Now, seeing him older, softer, more reflective, and visibly changed by time, some people say it is hard to watch. But maybe it is hard to watch because it reminds us that legends age too. The crossover slows down. The body changes. The face carries history. The voice grows heavier. The fire does not disappear, but becomes different. It becomes memory. It becomes wisdom. It becomes regret. It becomes survival. Allen Iverson's story is not over, but it no longer looks like a highlight reel. It looks like a man standing in the aftermath of everything he survived, trying to understand what it all meant. And in that way, his current chapter may be more powerful than any game he ever played, because now he is not trying to beat defenders. He's trying to make peace with himself. For many fans, Allen Iverson will always be frozen in time. They remember him sprinting down the court with the ball low in his hand, eyes sharp, body leaning forward like he was attacking life itself. They remember the crossover that made defenders lose balance. They remember the sleeve on his arm, the braids, the tattoos, the fearless drives into the paint. They remember the way he would fall hard, lie there for a second, then rise again as if pain was just another defender he had to beat. But the man himself could never stay frozen. Time moved. The game moved. The world moved. And Allen Iverson had to move with it, even when moving forward meant leaving behind the version of himself that everyone loved most. That is one of the cruelest things about fame. The public often falls in love with a person at one stage of life, and then struggles to accept that the person has changed. Fans wanted Iverson to remain young, explosive, untouchable, and defiant forever. They wanted the same fire, the same swagger, the same impossible confidence. But nobody can live forever inside their own prime. Eventually, even legends have to become ordinary men. And for Allen Iverson, ordinary was never easy. He had spent most of his adult life being treated like a symbol. To some, he symbolized rebellion. To others, danger. To many, hope. To the NBA, he was both a marketing dream and a cultural headache. To Philadelphia, he was a warrior. To young fans, he was proof that greatness did not need permission. But carrying that many meanings can make a person lose sight of something simple, who there when nobody is watching. Iverson's life after basketball forced him into that uncomfortable space. There were no more defenders to embarrass. No more playoff battles to prepare for. No more MVP chants echoing through an arena. The world still remembered him, but memory is not the same as presence. A retired athlete can be famous and still feel invisible. He can be loved by millions and still feel alone in a room. He can be celebrated as a legend and still wake up wondering what comes next. That is the pain many people do not understand. When Iverson was playing, his purpose was obvious. Score, fight, lead, prove them wrong. Every game gave him a mission. Every critic gave him fuel. Every bruise gave him proof that he was still in the battle. But when the battle ended, the same mindset that had carried him through basketball could not automatically carry him through life. Life after greatness requires a different kind of courage. It requires patience. It requires reflection. It requires admitting that the applause was not enough to fix everything. It requires looking back at choices that cannot be changed and people who may have been hurt along the way. It requires accepting that being loved as a legend does not erase the work of becoming whole as a man. That is why Iverson's recent chapter feels so emotional. Because for the first time, many fans are not watching him dominate. They are watching him reflect. They are watching a man who once answered every challenge with speed and defiance now face challenges that cannot be crossed over. Aging cannot be crossed over. Regret cannot be crossed over. The past cannot be crossed over. Healing takes longer than a fast break. And healing is not always pretty. It does not always happen in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it happens quietly, through conversations, apologies, honesty, and small decisions made when no cameras are around. Sometimes it looks like stepping away from old habits. Sometimes it looks like rebuilding relationships. Sometimes it looks like finally telling your own story after years of letting other people tell it for you. For Iverson, that matters, because so much of his life was narrated by others. Reporters told the public what they thought he was. Critics told fans what they thought he represented. Commentators turned his emotional moments into entertainment. Strangers debated his character as if they knew his heart. But being famous does not mean being understood. In fact, fame can make misunderstanding even worse, because everyone thinks they know you simply because they have seen your face. Iverson was seen everywhere. But was he truly heard? That question gives his story its deepest sadness. The young man who electrified basketball also spent years trying to defend himself from labels. Too street, too selfish, too reckless, too emotional, too stubborn, too much. Those words followed him, even while he was giving fans some of the most courageous performances the sport had ever seen. And yet, the very things people criticized became part of what made him unforgettable. His emotion made him real. His stubbornness made him fearless. His style made him iconic. His refusal to conform made him historic. Had Allen Iverson been quieter, safer, and easier to control, he might have been more comfortable for the league. But he would not have been Allen Iverson. That is the contradiction at the center of his life. The world loved him because he refused to change, then punished him because he refused to change. It celebrated his authenticity when it sold tickets and shoes, but criticized that same authenticity when it made people uncomfortable. It wanted his pain when it made him heroic, but rejected his pain when it became complicated. It wanted the warrior, but not always the wounded man inside the armor. Now, years later, the armor is not as heavy as it once was. The older Allen Iverson appears more reflective, more aware of what life has cost him. He still carries the spirit that made him famous, but there is a different weight in him now. The fire is still there, but it burns through memory instead of motion. His face tells stories that statistics never could. His voice carries the sound of someone who has been praised, blamed, loved, judged, and still somehow kept going. That is why watching him now can be difficult. Not because he has lost his greatness, but because his greatness has become human. It is no longer protected by speed. It is no longer wrapped in highlight reels. It stands in front of us as something quieter and more vulnerable. A man who once seemed larger than life is now reminding everyone that being larger than life can be a lonely place to live. And maybe that is what fans are really reacting to. They are not just sad for Allen Iverson. They are sad for time. They are sad that childhood heroes grow older. They are sad that the players who once made them feel invincible also had wounds of their own. They are sad that the past cannot be replayed, no matter how many highlights remain online. But there is also beauty in this chapter, because Allen Iverson is still here. After all the criticism, all the injuries, all the pressure, all the personal storms, all the public judgment, and all the years of being misunderstood, he is still standing. Maybe not in the way fans once imagined. Maybe not under the brightest lights. Maybe not with a basketball in his hands. But standing nonetheless. And that matters. Sometimes survival is not dramatic. Sometimes it does not come with a trophy or a standing ovation. Sometimes survival is simply waking up, facing your past, choosing honesty, and trying again. For a man like Allen Iverson, who spent his life fighting battles in public, that kind of quiet survival may be the most powerful victory of all. He was once the fastest man on the floor. Now, his journey is slower. But maybe that is exactly why it means more. There's a strange kind of grief that comes with watching a hero become human. For years, Allen Iverson existed in the minds of fans as something almost mythical. He was the little giant, the fearless scorer, the man who ran directly into contact as if pain had no authority over him. He was the player who could be bleeding, limping, exhausted, and still demand the ball. He made people believe toughness was not about size. It was about refusing to disappear. But the problem with becoming a symbol is that people forget you are made of flesh. They remember the moments, not the cost. They remember the crossover, not the hours in treatment. They remember the MVP speech, not the loneliness after the cameras turned off. They remember the step over, not the pressure of carrying a team, a city, a culture, and an entire generation's expectations on shoulders that were already bruised from life. Iverson gave the world everything it wanted from him, and then the world still wanted more. That is where the sadness begins. Not in the trophies he did or did not win. Not in the arguments about where he ranks among the greatest guards of all time. The real sadness is in the way Allen Iverson became a man millions loved, but not always a man millions understood. He was easy to admire when he was performing pain. When he turned injury into courage, fans called him a warrior. When he drove into defenders twice his size, people called him fearless. When he played through exhaustion, they said he had heart. But when that same pain appeared away from the court, in choices, emotions, habits, and personal struggles, many of those same people judged him. That is a cruel contradiction. Sports culture often rewards athletes for destroying themselves in competition, then criticizes them when the damage becomes visible in real life. Iverson was celebrated for giving his body to the game, but when his life after basketball looked complicated, the compassion was not always there. People wanted the heroic version of his suffering, not the messy version. But suffering does not stay neat. It leaks into relationships. It follows you into quiet rooms. It appears in the way you trust people, the way you spend money, the way you react to criticism, the way you handle silence, and the way you try to fill emptiness when the crowd is gone. For Allen Iverson, the crowd had been everything. The roar of Philadelphia was not just noise. It was confirmation. It told him he mattered. It told him his fight had meaning. It told him all the pain had become something beautiful. In that city, he was not just a player. He was a reflection of the people. Tough, imperfect, emotional, loyal, and proud. Philadelphia did not love Iverson because he was perfect. Philadelphia loved him because he was not. That bond is still one of the most powerful relationships between a player and a city in modern sports. The people saw their own struggle in him. They saw a man who might miss shots, argue, fall short, and make mistakes, but would never cheat them of effort. Every night, he emptied himself on the court. Win or lose, he gave them his truth. But truth can be heavy, especially when the truth is that the same qualities that made Iverson great also made his life harder. His loyalty could become vulnerability. His pride could become isolation. His confidence could make adjustment painful. His refusal to back down could turn even small conflicts into battles. The armor that protected him as a young man did not always serve him as an older one. And that is something many people learn too late. The survival skills that save you in one chapter can hurt you in the next. As a young player, Iverson needed that edge. He needed that suspicion. He needed that fire. He needed to believe no one could stop him because doubt would have swallowed him whole. But after basketball, when the fight changed, that same edge could not solve everything. You cannot attack healing like a defender. You cannot outrun regret. You cannot win peace by force. Peace requires surrender. And surrender was never something Allen Iverson was trained to do. That is why his journey now feels so different from the highlight reels. It is slower, quieter, and more painful. There are no instant replays for growth. No announcer screaming when a man chooses sobriety, reconciliation, reflection, or accountability. No arena explodes when someone admits they were wrong. No scoreboard rewards a person for trying to become better after years of being misunderstood. But those victories may be bigger than anything he did on the court, because the opponent is invisible. It is memory. It is pride. It is regret. It is temptation. It is the version of yourself everyone expects you to remain. It is the fear that without the game, without the applause, without the identity of the answer, you may not know who you are. That kind of battle is harder than basketball. Basketball gave Iverson defenders he could see. Life gave him wounds he could not always name. And yet, he is still here. That fact alone carries weight. Allen Iverson has been criticized, mocked, doubted, and misread for decades. People have written endings for him over and over. They have treated his struggles like proof that his critics were right. They have reduced a complex human being into simple cautionary tales about fame, money, and attitude. But Iverson has always been more than a warning. He is also a reminder that greatness can come from pain, a reminder that culture often changes because someone is brave enough to be rejected first, a reminder that the people who look the strongest may be carrying wounds no one sees, a reminder that even when a person makes mistakes, their humanity does not disappear. Allen Iverson's story is hard to watch because it forces fans to look beyond nostalgia. It forces them to admit that the player who made them feel young, fearless, and alive was fighting battles they never fully understood. It forces them to see that fame did not protect him. Money did not complete him. Applause did not heal him. And basketball, the thing he loved most, could not answer every question in his life. Maybe that is the true meaning of his nickname now. Maybe the answer was never about having all the solutions. Maybe it was about forcing the world to ask better questions. Questions like, what do we owe the athletes who give us everything? Why do we celebrate pain on the court, but judge it off the court? Why do we demand authenticity from stars, then punish them when that authenticity makes us uncomfortable? And why do we wait until legends are older and wounded before we finally call them human? Allen Iverson may never be the same man fans remember from 2001, but he does not need to be. The young Iverson gave us greatness. The older Iverson gives us something deeper, truth. And sometimes, truth is harder to watch than any fall. One of the most painful things about Allen Iverson's life is that people always wanted to define him before they understood him. They wanted him to be a hero, a villain, a rebel, a cautionary tale, a cultural icon, a problem, a victim, a legend. But Allen Iverson was never just one thing. He was all of it and more. He was brilliant and flawed, generous and guarded, fearless and wounded, loved by millions, yet often alone in ways only he could explain. That complexity is what made him real. But reality is not always comfortable for the public. Fans like simple stories. They like clean arcs. A poor kid rises from nothing, becomes a superstar, wins championships, retires gracefully, smiles at ceremonies, and lives happily ever after. That is the story people want because it feels safe. It makes success look like a straight road. It makes pain look temporary. It makes greatness look like protection. But Allen Iverson's story was never that simple. His rise was dramatic, but his life after the rise was complicated. His talent opened doors, but it did not erase his past. His money changed his surroundings, but it did not automatically heal his wounds. His fame made him visible, but did not guarantee that people truly saw him. And that may be the hardest part. Iverson was one of the most watched athletes of his generation, yet still one of the most misunderstood. Cameras followed him. Reporters questioned him. Analysts judged him. Fans debated him. But being watched is not the same as being known. Sometimes the more famous a person becomes, the less space they have to be human. Every emotion becomes a headline. Every mistake becomes evidence. Every bad day becomes part of a permanent public record. For Iverson, that meant there was almost no room for growth without judgment. When he was young and defiant, people called him immature. When he was older and struggling, people called him tragic. When he was emotional, they called him unstable. When he was quiet, they assumed the worst. No matter what he did, someone was ready to turn his life into a lesson. But people are not lessons. They're living stories. And Allen Iverson's story still has chapters that deserve compassion. To understand why his current life hits so hard, you have to understand what he represented at his peak. He was not just a scorer. He was a revolution in sneakers. He changed the emotional language of the NBA. Before him, many stars were expected to appear polished, controlled, and carefully managed. Iverson brought something raw. He brought the street into the spotlight. He brought vulnerability disguised as toughness. He brought a style that the league could not fully control. And for that, he paid a price. The backlash was not only about basketball. It was about image. It was about culture. It was about who was allowed to be the face of a billion-dollar league. Iverson challenged comfort zones. He made executives nervous. He made critics louder. He made fans who felt invisible feel powerful. That kind of impact does not come without resistance. Looking back now, many people admit that Iverson was ahead of his time. The tattoos, the fashion, the music, the attitude, the emotional honesty, all of it became normal later. Today's players can express themselves in ways Iverson helped make possible. But when he did it, he was often treated like a threat. That is the loneliness of being first. You get blamed for opening doors that others later walk through freely. You become the storm before the acceptance. And when people finally recognize your influence, years have already passed. The criticism has already left marks. The battles have already taken pieces of you. The world may eventually apologize through praise, but praise does not erase what it felt like to be attacked while you were living it. That is why Allen Iverson's legacy is so emotional. He was loved loudly, but also judged harshly. He inspired millions, but often had to defend his own humanity. He changed the game, but the game did not always know how to care for him. And when his playing days ended, the public still expected him to perform some version of greatness, even without the stage that had once given him purpose. Retirement did not remove the pressure. It changed the shape of it. Instead of being asked to carry a team, he was asked to carry a legacy. Instead of being judged by points and wins, he was judged by appearances, interviews, rumors, and old expectations. People wanted him to be healthy, happy, mature, grateful, reflective, and inspiring, but they often forgot that healing does not happen just because fans demand it. Healing is private work, and private work is hard when your life has always been public. That is why any sign of growth from Iverson matters. When he speaks honestly about his past, it matters. When he reconnects with family, it matters. When he talks about changing habits, it matters. When he allows people to see a softer side of him, it matters. Not because it creates a perfect redemption story, but because it reminds us that people can continue evolving long after the world thinks it has already figured them out. Allen Iverson does not need to become a perfect symbol in order for his story to have meaning. In fact, his imperfections may be the reason his story matters so much. Perfect legends are easy to admire, but imperfect legends are easier to feel. They remind us of ourselves. They show us that talent does not remove struggle, that fame does not prevent regret, that money does not guarantee peace, that being loved by strangers does not replace being understood by the people closest to you. And Iverson, more than most, shows how heavy a life can become when a person is constantly expected to be strong. Strength became his brand, but even strength needs rest. The young Iverson could run through defenders, ignore pain, silence critics, and turn anger into points. The older Iverson faces something different. He faces memory. He faces the consequences of years lived at full speed. He faces the challenge of being remembered for who he was while still trying to become who he is. That is not weakness. That is life. And maybe that is why watching him now feels so emotional. It is not just sadness. It is recognition. Fans see him and remember their own lost time, their own mistakes, their own younger selves who thought toughness would be enough to survive everything. Allen Iverson proved that toughness can take you far, but his life also shows that toughness alone cannot heal everything. At some point, even the strongest fighter has to stop swinging and start listening. Listening to his pain, listening to the people who stayed, listening to the lessons that only arrive after the noise fades. That is the chapter Allen Iverson seems to be living now. Not the chapter of the fearless scorer, not the chapter of the misunderstood rebel, not the chapter of the fallen superstar, but the chapter of a man trying to understand the full weight of his own life. And maybe that is not hard to watch because it is hopeless. Maybe it is hard to watch because it is honest. The older Allen Iverson gets, the more his story stops looking like a sports story. It starts looking like a human story. Because at some point, the numbers are no longer enough. The points, the awards, the all-star selections, the MVP trophy, the finals run, the legendary highlights, they all matter, but they do not explain the full weight of what people see when they look at him now. They see history. They see pain. They see survival. They see a man who gave the world a version of courage that was loud, fast, and unforgettable, and is now learning a quieter kind of courage. The courage to reflect. The courage to admit that everything was not perfect. The courage to face a past that the world still talks about. For a long time, Allen Iverson lived like a man running against time. On the court, that speed was magic. He was impossible to contain because he moved like hesitation did not exist. 1 second, he was in front of a defender. The next second he was gone. That was his gift. But in life, speed can become dangerous. When you move too fast for too long, you do not always notice what you are carrying. You do not notice the pain until the noise stops. And for Iverson, the noise was enormous. Every arena, every camera, every argument, every headline, every expectation, it all became part of the storm around him. People watched him for entertainment, but they also watched him for judgment. They cheered when he amazed them, then criticized when he refused to behave the way they expected. He was loved and policed at the same time. That kind of fame is exhausting. It tells you that you are special, but it also tells you that you are never free. You can have millions of fans and still feel trapped inside their opinions. You can have your face on posters and still feel like people do not know your heart. You can be called a legend and still carry the pain of being treated like a problem. That contradiction followed Iverson for most of his career, and maybe it followed him even after the career was over. Because when a person spends years defending himself, he can forget what it feels like to simply exist without armor. Iverson always seemed armored. His confidence was armor. His style was armor. His defiance was armor. His toughness was armor. Even his silence at times felt like armor. But armor is heavy, and sooner or later, every fighter has to decide whether he still needs to carry it. That is what makes his later years so compelling. Fans are not watching the same Allen Iverson who once humiliated defenders with a crossover. They're watching a man who appears to be slowly setting down pieces of the armor that protected him. They're watching someone who has been forced to understand that survival and peace are not the same thing. Survival got him through. Peace asks for something else. Peace asks a person to stop performing strength and start building stability. Peace asks a person to stop confusing motion with progress. Peace asks a person to look at the damage honestly, not with shame, but with responsibility. That is difficult for anyone. It is even more difficult when the world has spent decades treating your life like public property. Allen Iverson's pain was never private enough. As a young man, he was judged in courtrooms and newspapers. As a star, he was judged in arenas and television studios. As a retired legend, he was judged through rumors and social media clips. Every era of his life came with an audience. That kind of constant exposure can make it hard to heal because healing requires space. It requires silence. It requires time away from people who think they already know the ending. But Iverson's ending has not been written. That is important. Too often, people talk about him as if his story is already finished. They frame him as a tragedy, a warning, a fallen icon. But that is too easy. It is also unfair. A man's lowest moments are not his entire identity. His mistakes do not erase his growth. His struggles do not cancel his influence. And his vulnerability now does not make his greatness any less real. If anything, it makes the greatness more meaningful. Because now we understand the cost. We understand that every fearless drive came from a man who had learned to fight long before basketball paid him. We understand that every emotional interview came from a place deeper than ego. We understand that every act of defiance was, in some way, an attempt to protect a self the world kept trying to reshape. Allen Iverson was not perfect, but perfection was never why people loved him. They loved him because he was real in a world that often rewards pretending. They loved him because he played like every possession mattered. They loved him because he made pain look powerful. They loved him because he refused to shrink, even when the world tried to make him smaller. And now, maybe the challenge is different. Maybe now, Allen Iverson does not need to prove he is tough. Everyone already knows that. Maybe now, he does not need to prove he changed the game. The evidence is everywhere. Maybe now, he does not need to prove he belongs among the legends. His place is secure. Maybe now, the only thing he needs is peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from everyone finally agreeing about his legacy. That may never happen. Not the kind of peace that comes from erasing mistakes. No one could do that. But the deeper kind of peace that comes from accepting the whole story. The triumphs, the wounds, the love, the failures, the criticism, the impact, and the survival. That is why this chapter is hard to watch, but also impossible to look away from. Because Allen Iverson is no longer teaching fans how to be fearless with a basketball in their hands. He is teaching them something heavier. He is showing what it looks like when a man who once outran everyone finally has to slow down and face himself. He is showing that even the strongest people may need years to understand their pain. He is showing that legends are not protected from loneliness, regret, aging, or consequence. But he is also showing that being wounded does not mean being finished. That may be the most important part. Allen Iverson's life is not just a story about what fame can take from a person. It is also a story about what remains after fame changes shape. Love remains. Influence remains. Memory remains. Family remains. The chance to grow remains. And for a man who has already survived so much, that chance is not small. It is everything. So when people say what is happening to Allen Iverson right now is hard to watch, maybe they're only seeing half the picture. Yes, it is hard to watch a hero age. Yes, it is hard to see the cost of a life lived under pressure. Yes, it is hard to accept that the man who once looked unstoppable was always human. But there is something powerful in watching him still stand. Because Allen Iverson was never just the answer because he solved everything. He was the answer because he forced people to feel something. And even now, after all these years, he still does.